When you think of ancient Egypt, you probably imagine the pyramids, the gold masks, or the silent statues of gods that towered above the desert. But before we get lost in that grandeur, let us pause and ask a quieter question. What did ordinary Egyptians do at night, after the work of the day was done? When the Nile had finished flooding, the cattle had been fed, and the torches were lit inside the mud brick homes? The answer is surprisingly simple. They played. Long before television, smartphones, or even books in the way we know them, human beings still had the same restless need for distraction. Night stretches long when you live by the rhythms of the sun, and boredom has always been one of history's most stubborn companions. In Egypt, that boredom was answered with something deceptively small: board games. To understand why Egyptians invented games, you need to imagine their evenings. Picture a narrow home, built from mud brick. Its walls warm even after sunset because the desert heat lingers. A single oil lamp flickers with faint smoke, casting shadows against the plaster walls. Families gathered around low mats, eating flatbread, lentils, onions, and perhaps a little dried fish if fortune had been kind. The workday was often exhausting. Farmers spent daylight in the fields, bent over barley and emmer wheat. Laborers hauled limestone blocks. Scribes hunched with reed pens. But at night, something shifted. The world slowed down. Conversation dulled. Silence crept in. It is here, in these hushed rooms, that games came alive. The Egyptians called it Senate. The word means something like passing. And the game itself was about movement, luck, and survival, in ways more profound than you might think. A Senate board was simple. A grid of 30 squares, arranged in 3 rows of 10. Pieces were moved across the board, their progress determined by the throw of sticks or knuckle bones, which acted like early dice. 2 players sat across from one another, pushing their pieces forward, blocking their opponent, trying to reach the final square. At first glance, it seems ordinary, a race game, like a prehistoric version of backgammon. But Senate was more than idle entertainment. To the Egyptians, the game reflected life itself. Each piece's journey across the board was a mirror of the soul's journey through the afterlife. The obstacles in safe squares weren't just rules. They were symbols of cosmic order and chaos. When an Egyptian rolled badly, it wasn't simply bad luck. It was a glimpse of fate, of the gods nudging them off course. And when they won, it was more than victory. It was a triumph of order over disorder, of the eternal struggle for balance, which the Egyptians called Ma'at. What makes Senate fascinating is how quickly it outgrew its humble role. By the Old Kingdom, over 4,000 years ago, boards of Senate were already carved into the stone roofs of tombs and temples. Archaeologists have uncovered delicate Senate sets in the burial chambers of pharaohs, their playing surfaces inlaid with ivory, ebony, and faience. Why would anyone bury a board game with the dead? Because Senate was not just a pastime, it was preparation. The Egyptians believed that playing Senate was practice for the soul's journey after death. Each move on the board symbolized progress through the underworld. Each safe square a resting place. Each setback a trial to be overcome. The gods themselves were thought to play. Some tomb paintings even show Osiris, god of the dead, watching closely as a player moves their piece. To lose at Senate was not just to be defeated. It was to falter in the eyes of the divine. So, when a family in a small home played Senate by lamplight, laughing softly at a lucky throw, they were not only filling an idle evening, they were rehearsing eternity. It's easy to imagine board games as luxuries, but Senate was accessible in many forms. Wealthy nobles had finely crafted boards, with sliding drawers to hold pieces, their surfaces decorated with hieroglyphs. But the poor often scratched 30 squares onto a slab of limestone, or even drew them into the dirt, using pebbles for tokens. What seems dull to us? The exact number of squares, the length of the sticks used as dice, the placement of symbolic squares, mattered enormously to them. These rules gave shape to chaos, allowing the players to glimpse a fragile kind of order. One might even say the boring detail of Senate, its squares, its pawns, its little wooden sticks, were what made it eternal. Without those details, it would have been forgotten, like countless other games that left no trace. Some of the most haunting images of Senate come from tomb paintings. Imagine descending into a chamber carved deep into the cliffs near Luxor. The air is still, the walls lined with faded colors. There, among scenes of offering tables and funerary boats, you see a nobleman seated before a Senate board, his opponent invisible. Why invisible? Because the opponent was often death itself. These paintings suggest that in the afterlife, the soul would continue to play, rolling and moving until it reached safety in the realm of the blessed. Senate was not a mere distraction. It was a promise that even in death, one could play, and perhaps, by playing well, find peace. Let us pause and imagine the sound of an evening in Thebes or Memphis, the flick of wooden sticks on a mat, the scrape of a piece across a board, the low murmur of strategy, the suppressed laughter of a well-timed block. Outside, the Nile flows quietly, unseen in the darkness. Above, the stars of Orion and Sirius shine down, the same stars that guided Egyptian myth. This sound of a game being played is not the sound of kings or armies. It is the sound of ordinary people, ordinary evenings, ordinary lives. And yet, it is the sound of something that endured for millennia. As we sit with the image of Egyptians playing Senate by lamplight, one question lingers. Did they think of it as mere play? Or did every throw of the sticks remind them of something deeper? That life itself was a game of chance, where survival depended on the favor of gods, the roll of fate, and the fragile balance of order? If Section 1 showed us the flickering oil lamps and the scratchy limestone boards of everyday Egyptians, Section 2 takes us deeper, into temples, palaces, and tombs, where the game of Senate transformed from a pastime into a spiritual weapon. At first, Senate was simply a diversion. Farmers, merchants, and children could play it after long days of labor. But like many ordinary things in history, bread, water, even taxes, it soon gained weight. The higher classes began to adopt Senate, turning it into a game of prestige. A simple game board carved in dirt became one inlaid with ivory. Clay pawns became polished faience figurines. And just as board games today often reveal subtle rivalries in families, in ancient Egypt they revealed status. To own a fine Senate board was to declare that you belonged among the literate, the privileged, those who had time for leisure. The pharaoh himself was no stranger to the game. In fact, several Senate sets were discovered in the tomb of Tutankhamun, crafted with exquisite care. These were not idle objects. They were sacred. Why did the kings of Egypt play? Because Senate wasn't just practice for an evening's entertainment. It was practice for the afterlife. The Egyptians imagined death not as silence, but as a long and treacherous journey. The soul would face obstacles, rivers of fire, hostile spirits, and divine judges. To survive, it needed to know the rules, just as a Senate player needed to know which square was safe and which spelled disaster. A poor farmer playing on a scratch board might have thought only of a lucky throw, but a pharaoh, seated in his palace, might have seen every move as a rehearsal for eternity. When he rolled the sticks, he was rolling for his soul. This belief gave Senate its gravity. The more it was played, the more it merged with religion, until no line remained between game and ritual. By the Middle Kingdom, Senate was appearing in religious texts. The squares of the board were increasingly inscribed with hieroglyphs representing concepts like life, death, rebirth, and safe passage. Some boards bore protective spells, written to shield the soul as it advanced. Priests may have used the game as a symbolic tool, teaching the mysteries of the afterlife through play. Imagine a priest in white linen robes, seated across from a novice, the board between them. Each move was not only a lesson in rules, but a rehearsal of theology. The game was becoming eternal. One of the most striking images of Senate comes from the tomb of Queen Nefertari, wife of Ramses II. On the plastered walls of her burial chamber, she is shown sitting serenely before a Senate board. Her opponent is unseen, but the implication is chilling. She is playing against fate itself, or perhaps the gods. The image is quiet, almost boring, yet it carries immense weight. To the Egyptians, a game was never just a game. It was an echo of cosmic order, a reflection of their entire worldview. Modern archaeologists have uncovered Senate boards of astonishing variety. Some are elaborate, with sliding drawers to store pieces. Others are crude, just 30 scratched squares on stone. The differences speak volumes about Egyptian society. A poor laborer could carry a crude stone board and still feel he held the universe in his hands. A noble could unroll an ivory-inlaid masterpiece and believed the gods were watching. Both played the same game. Both rehearsed for the same afterlife. In this way, Senet was a rare equalizer, one of the few cultural bridges between rich and poor. It might sound dull to dwell on how exactly the game was played, but historians know these details matter. Senet used throwing sticks, not dice. 4 flat sticks were tossed, each landing either marked or unmarked, producing results from 1 to 5. A 0 throw required the player to skip a turn. The 30 squares were not random. The last 5 held special significance. The 26th square represented rebirth. The 27th was a dangerous square of water. The 28th promised protection. The 29th was a square of goodness. The 30th was a square of triumph, the soul's final rest. To move across these squares was not just a win. It was to mimic the very passage of existence. Over time, Senet spread outward. Traces of similar games have been found in neighboring regions, like Nubia and the Levant. Some scholars even believe it inspired later games in Mesopotamia and Rome. But only in Egypt did it retain such spiritual importance. To play Senet in another culture might have been mere amusement. To play it in Egypt was to touch the fabric of eternity. Imagine again the quiet home of an Egyptian family. A father and son sit before a scratched Senet board. The father explains each square, each throw, his voice calm but serious. The son laughs when he wins a round. He does not yet know that in this laughter, in this simple game, he is rehearsing something his ancestors will carry with them into their tombs. It is an ordinary evening, but beneath it, something eternal. If Senet began as a simple pastime and ended as a cosmic rehearsal, what does that say about the human need for play? Is it possible that every game we play, from cards to chess to video games of today, carries within a hidden ritual, a way of making sense of chaos, a way of rehearsing for things we cannot yet name? For more than 2,000 years, Senet was played along the banks of the Nile. Pharaohs played it. Priests blessed it. Farmers carved into stone. But even the most eternal-seeming traditions can fade, and Senet, once a game of gods, eventually slipped into silence. The decline of Senet is hard to trace. Unlike great monuments or papyrus scrolls, games leave only faint marks in the historical record. Boards break, pieces scatter, rules vanish into memory. By the time of the late period of Egypt, other games began to compete for attention. One of these was Mehen, the game of the snake. Its board was a spiral carved like a serpent coiling inward. Players raced their pieces along the snake's back, a strange echo of time's winding path. For a while, Mehen and Senet coexisted, but slowly Mehen and other diversions took over, while Senet began to look like an old relic. By the time Greek and Roman influences swept into Egypt, Senet had lost much of its religious power. The gods it once mirrored were being replaced, the rituals rewritten, the afterlife reimagined. The game that once trained souls for eternity now seemed like nothing more than an antique pastime. One of the strangest things about Senet is that we no longer know exactly how it was played. The board survive. The pawns endure. Even the throwing sticks have been found. But the rules, the true heartbeat of the game, are gone. Scholars have tried to reconstruct them, piecing together fragments from tomb inscriptions, comparing notes with similar games. Some say it was a race game. Others insist it was partly a strategy game. Still others suggest it combined chance and ritual in ways we can no longer imagine. The truth may be forever out of reach. Senet, once so alive, is now a puzzle with missing pieces. What remains is a shadow of play, the faint memory of laughter, the silent boards resting in museums. Senet may have disappeared, but board games never died. Humans carried the instinct for play across centuries. In Rome, people tossed knucklebones and moved pieces across wooden grids. In India, games like Pachisi emerged, eventually evolving into what the West calls Ludo. In China, the game of Go grew into a profound art strategy. Each of these games has its own character, its own rules, yet all of them share something Senet revealed. The way a board can become a map of life itself. When you sit across an opponent, watching the pieces advance, you're doing something Egyptians understood 5,000 years ago, confronting chance, testing fate, and finding order in the small ritual play. Today, replicas of Senate sit on coffee tables and museum shelves. Tourists in Cairo can buy wooden sets carved with hieroglyphs. Historians write careful articles about the meaning of the 30 squares. But in truth, Senate no longer exists as it once did. What we play now are only reconstructions, educated guesses about what the game might have been. Yet there is something strangely comforting about this survival. Even if the rules are lost, the fact that people still wish to play Senate, to throw sticks, to move pawns, to imagine what it meant to ancient souls, suggests the game still whispers across time. At first glance, board games are small, almost trivial. They do not build pyramids, raise armies, or write laws. But perhaps that is why they matter. In the spaces between labor and worship, humans have always needed something else. Something to ease the hours, sharpen the mind, and prepare the soul. For Egyptians, that need produced Senate. For us, it produces countless other games. And though the forms change, the need remains the same. We are creatures who must play, or else the silence of life becomes too heavy to bear. Imagine once more an Egyptian evening. 3,000 years ago, the oil lamp flickers. A family sits together. The board spread out before them. They laugh, they sigh, they move their pawns. Outside, the Nile flows endlessly, carrying silt and life through the land. That game ended long ago, but the memory of it lingers. And it leaves us with one question. If Senate could fade into silence after 2,000 years, how many of the games we play today, the ones we take for granted, will one day vanish, leaving only boards without rules, pawns without meaning, and echoes of laughter no one can understand? When you think of the Roman Empire, you probably imagine gladiators in arenas, generals marching with legions, or emperors draped in purple. But beneath the drama of conquest and politics lays something far quieter, far duller, and far more important: counting. Rome ran on numbers. Not abstract numbers written in equations, but living numbers. The number of citizens, the number of slaves, the number of soldiers ready to march. And to keep track, Rome relied on an institution both boring and brilliant: the census. The idea of a census is older than Rome, but the Romans perfected it. According to tradition, the first census was held by King Servius Tullius in the 6th century BC. At that time, Rome was still a small city, its wooden walls and muddy streets far from the marble grandeur it would later boast. But even then, leaders knew they needed to know who was who and what each man could contribute. The census was not a polite survey. It was a demand issued by the state for every Roman male citizen to stand up and declare his wealth, his property, his family, and his readiness for war. To be counted was to be placed in Rome's great machine, ranked, taxed, and when necessary conscripted. What made the census so powerful was not its drama, but its detail. Imagine rows of citizens lined up in the field of Mars, the open ground outside Rome's walls. Each man would step forward and announce his name, his age, his household members, his property, sheep, cattle, land, tools, his social class. Clerks, called scribi, recorded this information with styluses on wax tablets. These tablets were later recopied onto more permanent scrolls. The process was slow, tedious, and deeply bureaucratic. Yet from these dull records emerged a framework of Roman society. If you owned little, you were placed among the poor, with light taxes and low military obligation. If you owned much, you were placed among the wealthy, expected to pay more and to equip yourself as a heavily armed soldier. In short, Rome counted you, and by counting you, Rome decided your place in the world. At the top of this machine stood the censors, officials elected every 5 years. Unlike consuls or generals, censors didn't command armies or lead battles. Their power was quieter, but in some ways greater. The censors decided not only who was wealthy enough to fight, but also who was respectable enough to remain in good standing. They could strip a senator of his rank for dishonorable conduct. They could demote a knight who failed to live up to expectations. In other words, the census was not only about numbers, it was about morality. To be counted properly was to be acknowledged as a good Roman. To be struck from the rolls was to be shamed. The census wasn't just paperwork, it was a ritual. Citizens were expected to gather in the campus marshes, and present themselves to the censors. At the end of the process, a grand ceremony called a lustrum took place, in which priests purified the people with sacrifices. Think about that for a moment. Counting sheep, tallying farms, and scribbling names on wax tablets ended with the blood of sacrificial animals, smoke rising into the sky, and the belief that the gods themselves had blessed the numbers. It was bureaucracy wrapped in religion, which made it impossible to ignore. Without the census, Rome could not function. Taxes could not be collected fairly. Armies could not be raised efficiently. Land could not be managed. The empire may have been built by soldiers and emperors, but it was held together by scribes and censors, writing and rewriting the dull arithmetic of empire. In fact, the census was so central that it shaped the very idea of citizenship. To be Roman was not simply to live in Rome. It was to be entered in the rolls, to stand and declare yourself before the censors, to be recognized by the state. Picture a Roman farmer named Gaius, living outside the city. Once every 5 years, he walks to Rome with his sons, carrying a list of his property. He waits in line under the hot sun, the dust of the field of Mars rising around him. When his turn comes, he declares his household and his sheep. A scribe notes it down. It feels boring. It feels routine. Yet this act places Gaius in the heart of the empire. His name will decide how much he pays in taxes, whether his sons will serve in the legions, and whether his family will rise or fall in status. The Roman census was tedious, bureaucratic, and repetitive, yet it may have been one of the greatest tools of empire ever invented. And it leaves us with a question. Did Rome conquer the world with swords and legions, or did it conquer the world with lists and ledgers? When Rome was just a city-state, the census was a local ritual. But as Rome grew into a republic and then an empire, the census grew with it, stretching across seas and mountains to count millions of people who had never set foot in the city of Rome. At first, the census was limited to Roman citizens, men who could trace their rights back to the early families of Rome. But conquest changed everything. As Rome expanded into Italy and beyond, new people became subjects, allies, slaves, provincials, and eventually citizens. The census had to adapt. Now, it wasn't just about tallying farmers near the Tiber. It was about controlling entire provinces: Gaul, Hispania, Asia Minor, Judea, Egypt. Each region had to be assessed, taxed, and integrated. Imagine the challenge. No calculators, no spreadsheets, no digital archives. Just wax tablets, scrolls, and armies of scribes. And yet Rome managed to keep track of populations across 3 continents. The census was never neutral. It wasn't conducted out of curiosity. Its purpose was deeply practical, to know how much money and manpower could be extracted from the people. In provinces, officials arrived with local assistants to record who owned land, how much grain was produced, how many livestock grazed in the fields. These numbers determined taxes, tributes, and conscriptions. It wasn't glamorous work. Imagine trudging through dusty villages, asking farmers how many olive trees they owned. But these dull questions built the backbone of empire. Every legionary's pay, every aqueduct, every amphitheater depended on those boring figures scratched into wax. But the census wasn't just about money. It was about control. By counting people, Rome reminded them that they were not individuals floating free, but subjects tied to the empire. To be listed was to be known. To be known was to be governed. Even more, the census gave Rome the power to classify. People were not just counted, they were sorted. Citizens versus non-citizens. Free versus slave. Rich versus poor. Provincial versus Roman-born. These categories decided everything. Legal rights, punishments, obligations. We know from ancient writers that censuses could be disruptive events. In Judea, for example, a census ordered under the governor Quirinius sparked rebellion around 6 CE. To be counted by Rome was to be claimed by Rome, and not everyone accepted that claim quietly. In Egypt, the census was conducted every 14 years, producing papyrus records that still survive today. These documents reveal astonishing detail. Lists of households, ages of children, property inventories. Thanks to them, we can almost reconstruct the lives of ordinary people down to how many goats they owned. What feels like dusty paperwork today was, in reality, a lifeline of power. Without the census, the empire would have been blind. Behind every census stood an army of clerks. These men, often of low social standing, sat hunched over desks with styluses in hand. Their task was repetitive, even dull. Copy names, copy numbers, recopy onto scrolls. But they were the silent machinery of empire. It is easy to romanticize soldiers and emperors, but perhaps it was these anonymous scribes who truly held Rome together. Each name they etched was another life bound to the empire's network of obligation. Each corrected error was a potential rebellion prevented, a tax properly collected. Even as the census spread into provinces, it retained a religious undertone. In Rome itself, the ritual of the lustrum continued. The act of purification at the end of the count suggested that Rome was not just tallying citizens, but cleansing them, binding them together in divine order. For provincials, the message was clear. To be counted by Rome was to be absorbed into its world, not just politically, but spiritually. What strikes modern historians is the durability of the system. Every 5 years, generation after generation, Rome counted, copied, and purified. The process was tedious, repetitive, and unchanging. And that was its strength. Bureaucracy, not brilliance, kept the empire running. The Roman census stretched from the dusty farms of Egypt to the bustling markets of Gaul, from Italian villas to Judean hillsides. But its power raises a question. Was the census truly a tool of organization, or was it something more, a way for Rome to turn living, breathing people into numbers on a scroll, reducing human lives to mere entries in a ledger? The Roman census had begun as a local head count, expanded into a tool of empire, and became a ritual of power. But like everything Rome touched, it eventually began to crack. The census was both a triumph of order and a mirror of Rome's struggles. One of the strangest features of the Roman census was its moral authority. The censors were not merely bean counters. They were guardians of Roman virtue. They judged not only a man's property, but his behavior. If a senator was accused of corruption or disgrace, the censors could expel him from the Senate rolls. A knight could be stripped of his horse if judged unworthy. Even ordinary citizens could be punished with social demotion for offenses like cowardice, adultery, or failure to fulfill public duty. Imagine that. Your moral worth reduced to an entry on a list. To be struck off was more than bureaucratic inconvenience. It was public shame. The census, then, was never just numbers. It was the state's way of policing virtue, of reminding Romans that they were accountable not just to laws, but to ideals of discipline and order. As the empire expanded, the census grew ever more unwieldy. By the 1st century CE, Rome was trying to track tens of millions of people. Entire provinces had to be counted, recorded, and taxed. Errors crept in. Records grew inconsistent. Emperors sometimes manipulated the census for political ends. A generous emperor might undercount property to reduce taxes, winning popularity. A stricter one might demand higher assessments, filling coffers but breeding resentment. And yet, despite its flaws, the census remained one of the most enduring institutions in Rome. Long after civil wars toppled emperors, scribes continued scratching names onto tablets, proof that bureaucracy can outlast even chaos. But nothing lasts forever. By the later empire, the census began to falter. Constant warfare, invasions, and economic decline made it harder to conduct accurate counts. Whole regions slipped beyond Roman control, making enumeration impossible. Even within the empire, corruption spread. Local officials padded or reduced numbers to suit their interests. The meticulous 5-year rhythm broke down. The census, once a proud ritual, became a patchwork. When Rome finally collapsed in the West, the census collapsed with it. The ledgers closed. The scribes fell silent. For centuries, Europe returned to a patchier, less systematic way of tracking its people. And yet, the Roman census never truly died. Its shadow stretches into our own time. Modern censuses, conducted every decade in countries around the world, owe much to Rome's system. The idea that a state should know its population, classify its citizens, and use numbers to distribute power is Roman at its core. Even the word itself, census, comes directly from Latin. When modern governments mail out census forms or send surveyors door to door, they are echoing a ritual that began over 2,500 years ago on the dusty field of Mars. It is tempting to dismiss the census as dull. Lists, ledgers, property declarations, hardly the stuff of drama. But perhaps that is a lesson of Rome. Empires are not held together by heroes alone, but by paperwork. Not by glory, but by accounting. Not by the clash of swords, but by the scratch of a stylus on wax. As we close this story, imagine standing in line on the campus martius, waiting your turn to be counted. You give your name, your property, your family details. A scribe nods, scratches it down, and waves you on. It feels ordinary, forgettable. And yet that single moment ties you to empire, taxes, armies, morality, and fate. So the question remains. If Rome taught us that to be counted is to be seen, what does it mean today, in a world where we're counted constantly, not by censors and wax tablets, but by databases, algorithms, and unseen ledgers that still decide our place in society? When you imagine monks of the Middle Ages, you probably see them in long brown robes, heads bowed, chanting in candlelit chapels. That image is not wrong, but it is incomplete. For many monasteries, prayer was only part of daily life. Behind the stone walls and beneath the watchful eyes of abbots, monks engaged in another pursuit, quieter but equally essential, brewing beer. To understand why monks brewed, you need to step into the medieval world. Water was not always safe to drink. Wells could be contaminated, rivers carried disease, and stagnant water in barrels turned foul quickly. Beer, however, was boiled during brewing and preserved with hops or herbs, making it far safer than untreated water. In short, beer was survival. It quenched thirst, provided calories, and carried fewer risks than the water running in streams. For peasants and nobles alike, beer was daily bread in liquid form. And so monasteries, those self-sufficient islands of labor and prayer, became centers of brewing. Monks followed the rule of St. Benedict, which emphasized prayer, discipline, and silence. Brewing fit perfectly within this rhythm. It was labor, yes, but labor done quietly, with devotion. Imagine a monk stirring a cauldron of boiling wort, the steam rising around him, while he whispers prayers under his breath. The sound of bubbling beer was the music of obedience. Silence in the cloister did not mean inactivity. It meant that every motion, every stir of the mash, was done as an offering. Brewing was not just craft. It was worship. A monk's day was structured by bells. At dawn, they rose to chant. After prayers, they turned to work. Some tended gardens, some copied manuscripts, and some, the brewers, walked to the brewery. There, in low stone buildings with thick walls, they measured barley, ground malt, filled vats with water, and began the long process of brewing. The tasks were repetitive and meticulous. Heat the mash, skim the foam, wait for fermentation. If you visited, you might find rows of barrels lined against cool cellar walls, marked with chalk, quietly fermenting. It was not glamorous work, but it sustained the monastery and the surrounding villages. Monks did not brew beer only for themselves. Hospitality was a sacred duty. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor were fed and given drink at monastery gates. The beer offered was often small beer, low in alcohol but rich in calories, safe for children and the sick. For guests of higher standing, stronger brews were reserved, sometimes flavored with herbs and spices. In both cases, the beer was an extension of charity, nourishment for the body, provided in silence, without expectation of return. Though silent, the monks were meticulous record keepers. In monastic libraries, brewing instructions were copied alongside psalms and theological treatises. The records tell us how carefully they measured ingredients, adjusted boiling times, and experimented with flavors. It is from these records that we know monasteries were among the first in Europe to consistently use hops, giving beer both flavor and longevity. The boring detail of adding a handful of dried plants into boiling wort changed beer forever. We cannot know exactly what medieval monastic beer tasted like, but historians suggest it was thick, cloudy, and nourishing, more like a liquid loaf of bread than the golden lagers of today. It was food as much as drink, sustaining monks through long fasts and endless prayers. Imagine lifting a heavy wooden cup, the beer warm from fermentation, thick on the tongue, filling the stomach with strength. For the monks, this was not indulgence. It was necessity, wrapped in ritual. As we sit with the image of silent monks brewing beer in stone halls, we are left with a question. Did they see beer as simple nourishment? Or did every sip remind them that even the most ordinary tasks, brewing, drinking, sharing, could be a pathway to the divine? If the first chapter of monastic brewing was survival and devotion, the second was expansion. Brewing began as a necessity, but over time it became one of the most valuable assets of the medieval monastery. What started in silence soon echoed across Europe as monasteries grew into some of the most respected brewers in history. At first, beer was made primarily for monks, guests, and charity. But demand grew. Villagers, travelers, and pilgrims who tasted monastic beer recognized its quality. Compared to the rough, uneven brews of local taverns, monastic beer was cleaner, more consistent, and safer. Word spread quickly. Soon, people came not only to pray at monasteries, but to drink at them. And so the cloister, without ever raising its voice, became a hub of brewing excellence. Why were monks so good at brewing? The answer lies in discipline. Time. Unlike peasants struggling to survive, monks had the time to refine recipes. Resources. Monasteries owned land, which meant access to barley, hops, and clean water. Knowledge. Literacy gave monks an edge. They could record recipes, compare results, and preserve successful methods. Silence. Brewing required patience. Monks, trained in quiet endurance, were perfectly suited to the task. This combination turned monasteries into laboratories of brewing. The same methodical habits that produced illuminated manuscripts produced beer of unparalleled quality. As demand grew, beer became more than sustenance. It became revenue. Monasteries began to sell their surplus, using profits to maintain churches, fund construction, and support charitable works. For example, the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland had detailed plans showing a brewery as a central feature of monastic life. Beer was not an afterthought. It was an economic pillar. And unlike many medieval businesses, monastic brewing carried a reputation for fairness. People trusted the monks not to cheat them, not to water down their beer, not to manipulate prices. In a world of corruption and uncertainty, that trust was priceless. One of the most significant contributions of monastic brewing was the adoption of hops. Before hops, beer was flavored with herbs, a mixture called gruit. But gruit spoiled quickly. Hops, however, preserved beer longer and gave it a bitter balance. Monks experimented with hops as early as the 9th century. By the High Middle Ages, they had established hop beer as a standard across much of Europe. The dull detail of flour added to a vat transformed brewing forever. Without monastic patience, hops might never have become central. And without hops, beer might never have spread so widely. It is striking to consider, monks did not advertise. They did not shout in markets. They did not hang banners. Yet their beer became famous. Why? Because silence carried authority. A monastery was not seen as a business, but as a place of trust. People believed the monks brewed not for profit, but for God, and so their product carried weight. To drink monastic beer was not only to quench thirst, it was to share in holiness. Pilgrimage routes across Europe often ran to monastic centers. Pilgrims, weary from travel, would stop at abbeys to rest. There they were given bread, shelter, and beer. Many abbeys grew wealthy by serving thousands of travelers each year. This intertwining of faith and fermentation meant that beer was more than a drink. It was part of Europe's spiritual landscape, sustaining both body and soul on the long roads of devotion. If you leaf through monastic records, you won't find dramatic tales of battles or miracles. You'll find inventory lists, barrels of ale, sacks of barley, measures of hops, dull, repetitive entries, and yet these were the foundation of survival. Every chalk mark on a barrel, every note about fermentation times, preserved not just a brew but a tradition. In the boredom of bookkeeping lay the seeds of a legacy that would outlast empires. As monastic brewing turned from necessity into economy, one question lingers. Were the monks simply responding to demand, or did they sense that in every barrel rolled out of cloister gates, they were shaping a culture that would endure for centuries? Where beer would be not just survival, but civilization? Monastic brewing began as survival, grew into economy, and spread across Europe. But no tradition in history runs uninterrupted. Wars, reforms, and revolutions struck the monasteries, yet somehow the taste of their beer endured. This is a story of how brewing survived silence, suppression, and centuries. Throughout the Middle Ages, monasteries were not immune to violence. Armies marching through Europe often raided abbeys, stripping their wealth, seizing their grain, and drinking their beer. In some cases, breweries were destroyed entirely. Yet, remarkably, monks rebuilt. Brewing was too central to abandon. Each time a cloister was burned, the brewery was among the first structures to rise again. Beer was sustenance, not luxury. Without it, monks and their neighbors would struggle to survive. The greatest blow came not from war, but from reform. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation swept through Europe, closing many Catholic monasteries. In England under Henry VIII, monasteries were dissolved, their land seized, their breweries dismantled. Centuries of brewing knowledge risked vanishing. But not everywhere. In Catholic regions like Belgium, Germany, and Austria, monastic brewing continued, though under increasing pressure. Silence alone could not protect the cloisters from kings and reformers. Only persistence could. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many monasteries had been closed by secular authorities. Yet in hidden valleys and remote hills, a few abbeys continued brewing. Their names became legendary. Trappist monasteries like Chimay, Orville, and Westvalturen. These monks brewed not for profit, but for sustenance and charity, just as their predecessors had done. And yet their beer, rich, complex, crafted with patience, became renowned. Even today, Trappist beer is among the most respected in the world. What the monks did instinctively, modern science later explained. Fermentation, yeast, sterilization. These concepts were not understood in the Middle Ages. Monks did not know why boiling water purified it, or why yeast caused bubbling. They only knew it worked. Louis Pasteur, centuries later, revealed the science of fermentation. But the monks had been practicing it for 1,000 years, guided by discipline, observation, and habit. What seemed like dull repetition was, in truth, careful experimentation over generations. Modern monastic beer still carries something of the medieval cloister. Dark Alesh, heavy with malt, echo the liquid bread that sustained fasting monks. Stronger brews, reserved for guests, remind us of abbeys serving pilgrims on long roads. To drink one today is to taste continuity. It is not just beer. It is history in a glass, brewed in silence, poured across centuries. Think about it. Monasteries brewed for survival, kept records in silence, and rolled barrels through cloister gates. They did not intend to create a global tradition. Yet today, billions drink beer as one of the world's most popular beverages. This is a boring miracle of history. Great change comes not from sudden brilliance, but from small, repetitive acts. Stirring mash, boiling wort, rolling barrels, copying recipes. Monks did these things in silence, day after day, and in doing so, they shaped culture. As we leave the monastery halls, one question remains. If monks, bound by silence and obscurity, could shape the taste of the world with nothing more than barley, water, and patience, what other quiet traditions, hidden in today's routines, are quietly building the cultures of tomorrow? When night fell in ancient China, it came quickly and completely. Streets without lanterns sank into silence. Villages disappeared into shadow. Even the grand halls of emperors were dim, without the glow of oil lamps or candles. To understand daily life in that world, we must first understand how people lit the dark, and how something as boring as candle making became essential to survival, ritual, and empire. For centuries, light in China came from fire and oil. Pine wood torches flickered in humble homes. Oil lamps, carved from bronze or pottery, burned in palaces. But torches were smoky and oil lamps required constant tending. The flame guttered at the smallest draft. The oil spilled easily and the smoke blackened ceilings. People needed something steadier, something portable, something reliable. And so, around the Han Dynasty, the Chinese began crafting candles. Unlike the beeswax candles of medieval Europe, Chinese candles were often made from unusual materials. In wealthier households, beeswax was indeed used, but for the majority, Candles were made from animal fat, tallow rendered from cattle, sheep, or even fish. Some regions use the oil of the Chinese tallow tree, whose seeds produced a waxy coating that could be shaped into fuel. The process was slow and messy. Fat had to be melted down, impurities skimmed off, then poured around reeds or bamboo slivers to form a wick. Layer upon layer was added until the candle was firm enough to stand. It was not glamorous work. The smell lingered in the air. The wax hardened unevenly, but the result was light, and that was priceless. Candles were more than utility. They were symbols. In poorer homes, darkness was accepted. Torches sufficed. But in the homes of the wealthy, to keep a candle burning into the night was a statement of luxury. It meant you had the resources to waste fat or wax on light rather than food. In imperial palaces, candles burned not only for illumination but as decoration. Records from the Han and Tang dynasties describe banquets lit by hundreds of candles, their flames reflected in polished bronze mirrors, turning the night into shimmering daylight. What seems ordinary to us, a small flame on a wick, was in ancient China a marker of wealth and refinement. Candles also took on spiritual meaning. In Taoist and Buddhist practices, candles burned on altars, offerings of light to accompany incense and prayers. A candle flame symbolized a soul, fragile and flickering, yet capable of enduring if tended with care. Monks wrote of meditating by the flame, watching its dance as a lesson in impermanence. Officials lit candles during ceremonies to mark solemn moments. Even funerals employed them, their light guiding the spirits of the dead. The candle was never just fire. It was a bridge between the living and the divine. The daily work of candle making was far from poetic. Imagine vats of tallow, the smell heavy in the air, workers dipping reeds over and over into hot liquid, waiting for each layer to harden before dipping again. Candles were lined in rows, their shapes uneven, their surfaces cracked. These were the unglamorous details that kept China's nights alive. Without them, homes would go dark. Temples would lose their offerings. Officials would stumble through ceremonies half-blind. In the boredom of repetition lay the quiet power of civilization. As we picture the first candles flickering in ancient Chinese homes, one question rises. Did people see them as ordinary tools, or did each flame, fragile, trembling, stubborn against the dark, remind them that civilization itself is nothing more than a small light held against endless night? If the first candles in China were born out of necessity, their story did not end there. Over centuries, candle making evolved from a messy household task into an organized craft that touched trade, politics, and even the rhythms of court life. By the Han and Tang dynasties, candles had become a fixture of the imperial household. Records describe palaces illuminated by hundreds of flames during banquets, festivals, and ceremonies. The emperor's birthday, for example, might be celebrated in halls glittering with candlelight. Each flame was more than illumination. It was a performance of power. To keep candles burning all night long required immense resources. It was a demonstration that the empire could afford to waste fat, beeswax, and labor simply for spectacle. Candles turned the night into day, but more importantly, they turned wealth into visible fire. Outside the court, candles took on public significance in festivals. The Lantern Festival, held on the 15th day of the first lunar month, is famous for its glowing paper lanterns. But before lanterns dominated, candles played a central role. Families lined streets and temples with burning candles, their flames marking the turning of the year. In Buddhist monasteries, candles were lit in long rows during celebrations, their steady glow representing prayers carried upward. Taoist rituals, too, incorporated candles as symbols of longevity and fortune. The light of a single flame, multiplied across thousands of homes, became a shared language of community and faith. By the medieval period, candle making had become a small industry. Villages specialized in rendering tallow, collecting beeswax, or producing wicks. Markets sold candles in bundles, priced according to quality. Wealthier families bought smooth, smokeless beeswax candles. Poorer households settled for smoky tallow. Some regions gained reputations for their candles, much as others became known for silk or ceramics. The work was unglamorous, but the demand was steady. Every household, every temple, Every festival needed candles. This demand tied candle making to trade routes. Beeswax from distant provinces traveled to urban centers. Tallow, bulky and perishable, was rendered close to where animals were raised. The result was a quiet but important economic web built around the simple act of burning fat. One of China's most remarkable contributions was the use of the Chinese tallow tree, Triatica sabifera. Its seeds produced a waxy coating that could be pressed into solid fuel. This innovation offered an alternative to animal fat, reducing reliance on livestock. Farmers grew tallow trees specifically for this purpose, making them part of agricultural landscapes. By the Tang Dynasty, tallow candles were common, showing how resourceful Chinese candle makers had become in turning plants into light. To us, candle making might seem mundane, but its details mattered. The choice of which determined how evenly a candle burned. The purity of fat or wax decided whether the flame smoked. The shape of the base affected how long it lasted. Workers learned through trial and error, recording methods in local handbooks. These small, repetitive details, dipping, trimming, cooling, created the difference between a candle that sputtered out in minutes and one that burned through the night. Civilization rested on such details. Without reliable candles, rituals faltered, trade slowed, and court ceremonies dimmed. Writers and poets of China often used candles as symbols. A burning candle could signify loyalty, sacrifice, or fleeting time. The candle weeps as it burns, one Tang poet wrote, likening the dripping wax to tears. Scholars saw in the simple act of burning light a lesson about impermanence. Brightness purchased by consumption, beauty destined to melt away. Thus, the candle became both tool and teacher, a reminder that even the most ordinary objects can hold profound meaning. As candles moved from households to courts, from rituals to trade, they became threads in the vast fabric of empire. And yet we must ask, did the Chinese see candles as mere commodities, or did they sense, with every flame that burned down to smoke and ash, that light was not just survival, it was a very symbol of life's fragile endurance? For centuries, candles lit China's homes, temples, and palaces. They were at once practical and symbolic, mundane and sacred. But like all technologies, they did not last forever. The art of candle making, once a quiet craft, began to fade as new forms of light emerged. Even while candles flourished, oil lamps never disappeared. Advances in lamp design, bronze with hinged lids, pottery with reservoirs, even ingenious smoke-trapping devices, gradually made lamps more reliable. Compared to the messy labor of candle making, lamps seemed efficient. By the Song Dynasty, households increasingly preferred oil lamps for daily use. Candles still burned in rituals and ceremonies, but their dominance was already slipping. Lanterns, too, eclipsed candles. Constructed from bamboo, paper, and silk, lanterns became the central symbols of festivals. Their portability, color, and artistry turned them into works of culture rather than mere tools. A candle burning alone could provide light, but a lantern glowing in the streets provided spectacle. As lantern culture grew, candles became hidden inside, fuel for beauty rather than objects of attention themselves. The flame was no longer the star, the lantern was. By the later dynasties, candles had become increasingly associated with ritual rather than daily life. Poorer households turned to oil. Wealthier ones used lamps or lanterns. Candle making, once widespread, narrowed to specialized craftsmen. What had once been a household task became a niche trade. Families no longer rendered fat into candles each season. Instead, they purchased light in simpler forms. The art of candle making receded into obscurity. Yet candles never vanished entirely. Temples continued to burn them as offerings. Funerals required them. Weddings lit them for blessings. In these contexts, candles retained their power as symbols of purity, continuity, and the fragile human spirit. Even as technology moved forward, rituals pulled backward, keeping the flame alive. Today, few people know the precise methods of ancient Chinese candle making. How many layers of tallow were dipped? How exactly was tree wax processed? What ratios of wick to wax produced the cleanest flame? These details, once passed down from hand to hand, have largely been lost. What remains are archaeological traces, hardened lumps of wax, written notes in old manuals, faint references in poems. The craft that once lit dynasties now flickers only as history. And yet, the candle as metaphor endured. In Chinese poetry, candles often appear as symbols of sacrifice, knowledge, and fleeting time. A scholar might compare his life to a candle burning for others until extinguished. A lover might describe parting as a flame guttering in the wind. Though the art was forgotten, the image remained. Proof that even as technologies change, the meanings we attach to objects can outlast their use. Eventually, electricity rendered both lamps and candles obsolete for daily life. Cities blazed with electric bulbs, streets glowed with neon, and homes were lit at the flick of a switch. Against this brilliance, the candle seemed quaint, old-fashioned, almost irrelevant. Yet, ironically, candles return in another form, as luxury. Scented candles, decorative candles, candles for relaxation. All of these draw, unknowingly, on thousands of years of tradition. What was once survival became symbol again, now of comfort and ritual. So we end with a question. When the first Chinese candle was dipped in the tallow and lit against the dark, did its makers know that one day their craft would be forgotten? Not because it failed, but because it succeeded so well that light itself became ordinary. And in our age of electric abundance, when we light a candle for memory, for meditation, or for love, are we not, in some quiet way, keeping alive the forgotten art of ancient candle makers? If you picture Venice in the Middle Ages, you might imagine gondolas gliding across canals, marble palaces shimmering on the water, and masked revelers at festivals. But beneath that glamour was something more ordinary and far more powerful. Paper. Not paper for poetry, but for proof, the humble receipt. Venice was a city of trade. Its ships sailed to Constantinople, Alexandria, and beyond, carrying spices, silk, and precious metals. Deals were struck in warehouses, at docks, and across tavern tables. But trade depends on trust, and trust is fragile. A merchant handing over sacks of pepper wanted assurance he would be paid. A shipper delivering cloth wanted proof it had been received. Without records, every deal was a gamble. And so, Venice invented a tool to protect against memory's failures: the receipt. Early receipts were simple. A scribe wrote a note stating that one merchant had given goods to another, with details of quantity, weight, and value. The note was signed, sealed, and stored. If disputes arose, the receipt became evidence. What seems boring to us, ink on parchment, a few lines of text, was revolutionary. It turned fleeting words into durable proof. Why Venice? Because the city lived on trade. Every coin that clinked in Venetian coffers came from deals struck abroad. And Venetian merchants, pragmatic and cautious, understood that trade required more than courage and ships. It required paperwork. Venice was also literate. Merchants hired scribes, notaries, and clerks to record transactions. The state supported this with official archives. Soon, receipts became as common as coins, passed from hand to hand as tokens of trust. A typical Venetian receipt might include the names of the parties, the date and place, the goods delivered, the weight and measures, the amount owed, the signature or seal of witnesses. Dull details, but vital. With these words, merchants could sail across seas confident that their claims were backed not by memory, but by record. Receipts did more than resolve disputes. They created a new kind of power, the power of bureaucracy. A merchant with chest full of receipts held more than scraps of paper. He held evidence of wealth, proof of trustworthiness, and leverage in future deals. Paper became currency of a different sort, one based not on gold but on ink. Picture a Venetian dock in the 13th century. A merchant unloads bales of silk from the east. Another inspects them, nods, and hands over not coin but receipt, promising payment later. The first merchant accepts, knowing the paper carries weight in Venetian courts. It is a boring moment, ink drying on parchment. Yet in that moment, global trade becomes possible. The invention of receipts in Venice raises a simple but unsettling question. Was it ships and sailors that made Venice rich, or was it paper and scribes, the boring tools of record-keeping, that truly built the wealth of an empire? The receipt began as a scrap of proof, a promise scribbled in ink. But in Venice, nothing stayed small for long. The city that turned swamps into palaces also turned scraps of parchment into the foundations of banking. At first, receipts were tied to goods. Pepper unloaded, silk delivered, grain measured. But merchants quickly realized that a receipt could represent more than just a shipment. It could represent credit. If a wealthy merchant trusted another, he might accept a receipt not only as proof of goods, but as a promise of future payment. That receipt, in turn, could be passed on to someone else, like a portable IOU. Suddenly, paper was not just record, it was currency. Venetians did not rely on memory or goodwill. They institutionalized receipts. Transactions were recorded in the presence of notaries, who copied details into official registers. The notary's seal mattered. A simple mark of wax could make a receipt legally binding. Without it, the paper was just ink. With it, it was power. This bureaucratic web gave merchants confidence. They knew that behind each receipt stood not just one man's promise, but the weight of Venetian law. Receipts soon fed into larger systems of credit. A merchant short on cash could use receipts to borrow money. Another could use them to prove solvency to investors. Collections of receipts became portfolios, silent ledgers of wealth that grew without the clinking of coins. Venice, surrounded by water and dependent on trade, had little farmland and few resources, but had something better: paperwork that turned trust into trade and trade into empire. By the late Middle Ages, Venetian merchants pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, a system that recorded both credits and debits, ensuring every transaction balanced. Receipts played a role here as evidence of what entered and left accounts. To us, this might sound dull, like endless columns of numbers, but it was revolutionary. Double-entry bookkeeping allowed Venetian businesses to expand, track debts, and survive across generations. Without it, trade would have drowned in confusion. In Venice's marketplaces, receipts were traded as readily as goods. A merchant could hand over a receipt instead of coin. Another could accept it as proof of debt. What once was a boring piece of paper became a commodity in itself. To hold a Venetian receipt was to hold value. Imagine a merchant named Marco returning from Alexandria with spices. He sells them to Pietro, who pays not in coin, but with a receipt promising silver in 3 months. Marco, needing funds sooner, takes the receipt to a moneylender, who gives him coin at a discount. That receipt then circulates further, perhaps even ending in the hands of another merchant who never saw the original spices. It is all paper, moving silently through canals and counting houses, but it fuels ships, feeds sailors, and builds fortunes. Venetian receipts may seem small, but they laid groundwork for modern banking. They shifted wealth from the visible, chests of coins, bales of silk, to the invisible, promises, credits, and trust recorded in ink. In this way, Venice turned boredom into brilliance. As receipts grew into contracts and early banking tools, one question remains. Did the merchants of Venice know they were inventing finance, or did they simply think they were writing dull notes to settle disputes, never realizing those notes would outlast their ships and shape the modern economy? Receipts in Venice began as simple notes of proof, evolved into tools of credit, and grew into the lifeblood of banking. But like the empire itself, their story carried both brilliance and decline. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Venice was at the height of its mercantile power. Its fleets controlled Mediterranean trade. Its markets bustled with spices from the east, wool from England, and silver from Germany. Behind this glittering trade stood not only sailors and ships, but paper, stacks of receipts, contracts, and ledgers that tracked every sack, every coin, every promise. Receipts allowed Venetian merchants to expand beyond the limits of coin. Gold and silver were heavy, risky to transport, and always in short supply. But receipts could be written endlessly. A single sheet of parchment could carry the weight of thousands of florins. The influence of Venetian receipts stretched beyond the city. Other states, seeing Venice's prosperity, copied its methods. Genoa, Florence, and later Dutch and English merchants all borrowed Venetian bookkeeping practices. Receipts became the skeleton of long-distance trade. Without them, shipments would have been bound by the limits of physical money. With them, trust could cross oceans. Yet receipts could not protect Venice from larger forces. By the 16th century, new trade routes around Africa shifted the spice trade toward Portugal and Spain. Venice, once the middleman of East and West, found itself sidelined. The receipts still circulated, the notaries still wrote, but the goods that gave them value dwindled. Paper cannot float ships that no longer sail. Another change came with the printing press. Contracts, receipts, and records could now be mass-produced with greater consistency. What Venice had pioneered became standardized across Europe. The uniqueness of Venetian receipts faded as other cities caught up and surpassed them. Venice remained respected, but it was no longer unrivaled. Its receipts were now one voice in a growing chorus of European bureaucracy. Though Venice's empire declined, the legacy of its receipts never disappeared. The habit of writing proof, of trusting ink and signature more than spoken promise, became the foundation of modern commerce. Every invoice, every receipt, every credit slip in the world today carries a little echo of Venetian parchment. When you sign for a package or file a tax receipt, you are continuing a tradition born in warehouses on the Grand Canal. It is tempting to imagine that history is made by bold conquests and dramatic battles. But in Venice, history was also made by clerks bent over desks, scratching ink onto parchment in quiet counting houses. The brilliance of receipts was boring. They were repetitive, bureaucratic, and dry. Yet they built trust where there was doubt, order where there was chaos, and wealth where there was risk. So the story ends with a question. When we look at the faded receipts of Venetian merchants and museums, are we seeing scraps of parchment, or the true bones of empire, the invisible structure of trust that allowed one small city on the water to rule the world of trade for centuries? If history were written only in gold and battles, salt would be forgotten. Yet this dull, white crystal-shaped civilizations as profoundly as armies or kings. To understand its story is to see how something ordinary and invisible in our kitchens was once the foundation of survival, wealth, and empire. Salt preserved food. Before refrigeration, it was the only way to keep meat from rotting, fish from spoiling, and vegetables edible through winter. Without salt, survival in many regions would have been impossible. But salt was more than survival. It flavored bland diets, it healed wounds, it preserved corpses, it even featured in rituals. To have salt was to have security. To lack it was to risk famine. The Chinese were among the first to produce salt systematically. Archaeological evidence shows salt works along the Yangtze as early as 6000 BC, where brine was boiled in clay vessels. The Egyptians mined salt from dry lake beds, using it not only for food but for embalming mummies. In Europe, Celtic tribes harvested salt by boiling seawater. In Africa, caravans crossed deserts carrying salt slabs on camels, trading them ounce for ounce with gold. Salt, though boring, was a global currency long before coins became widespread. The need for salt carved paths into the earth. The Romans built Via Salaria, the salt road, along which brine and crystals were transported into the capital. Entire towns sprang up along salt routes, their fortunes tied to the flow of white crystals. Where salt moved, culture followed. Caravans of traders carried stories, ideas, and technologies alongside their sacks of salt. A mineral shaped not only diets, but maps. Rome taxed salt. China monopolized it. Kings and emperors understood that controlling salt was controlling life itself. In China, the state's salt monopoly funded armies and walls. In France, the hated Gabelle salt tax weighed heavily on peasants for centuries, fueling resentment that later exploded in revolution. Salt was invisible in palaces, yet always present in treasuries. Behind the glamour of empire lay tedium. Workers dug into dry beds, scraped crystals with crude tools, and hauled heavy sacks. Others boiled brine in blackened pots. Day after day, their lives spent inhaling steam. It was repetitive, exhausting, and uncelebrated. Yet, without these anonymous laborers, empires would have starved. For the ordinary family, salt determined survival. A farmer with salt could pickle vegetables for winter. A fisherman with salt could sell his catch far inland. A shepherd with salt could preserve cheese. These everyday acts, dull and domestic, were a foundation of resilience. Civilizations did not survive on monuments alone. They survived on salted fish and cabbage, salted pork and cheese. If something as dull as salt could hold empires together, what other ordinary things, unnoticed in our kitchens, forgotten in our markets, are quietly shaping the world around us today? Salt might seem dull, but in the hands of rulers it became a weapon sharper than swords. Control of salt meant control of survival, and kings, emperors, and states learned to wield it with ruthless efficiency. Perhaps no civilization used salt as systematically as ancient China. As early as the Han Dynasty, the state claimed exclusive control over salt production. No individual could mine or sell it without permission. Why? Because salt was universal. Every person needed it every day. Unlike land or gold, it could not be hoarded by the few. By monopolizing salt, the state guaranteed itself a steady river revenue. This revenue funded armies, built the Great Wall, and supported a sprawling bureaucracy. In a way, China's emperors built their empire not on silk or bronze, but on salt. Rome, too, grasped the power of salt. The word salary itself comes from salarium, a ration of salt once given to soldiers. Though historians debate whether soldiers were literally paid in salt, the connection reveals how central it was. Rome taxed salt across its provinces, ensuring that the wealth of conquered peoples flowed back into the capital. Even the mighty legions that marched across Europe relied on salted pork and fish, carried in barrels that preserved food for months. Without salt, armies would have rotted as quickly as their meat. Centuries later, in medieval and early modern France, salt again became the focus of power. The gabelle, a salt tax imposed by the crown, was one of the most hated levies in history. The tax varied by region, forcing some peasants to pay more than others. Smuggling thrived as desperate families evaded the crown's monopoly. The resentment grew so strong that by the 18th century, the gabelle became a rallying cry of revolutionaries. What began as a boring commodity turned into a spark for political upheaval. Salt's link to rebellion did not end in France. In India under British rule, the salt tax became a symbol of colonial oppression. The famous Salt March of 1930, led by Mahatma Gandhi, protested British monopoly on salt. Think about that. An empire that ruled over millions was challenged not by weapons, but by handfuls of salt gathered on beaches. A dull mineral became a tool of resistance. Throughout history, salt also acted as currency. In parts of Africa, slabs of salt were traded ounce for ounce with gold. In Ethiopia, salt blocks called amoles served as money well into the 20th century. This was not symbolic. It was practical. Salt had universal value, unlike coins that mattered only within specific states. A caravan carrying salt carried wealth that could not be debased. To maintain control, governments established entire bureaucracies around salt. Inspectors checked for smugglers. Guards patrolled roads. Ledgers recorded every ounce sold. It was tedious, repetitive work, stamping permits, weighing bags, writing receipts. Yet this boredom underpinned empires. Without the dull enforcement of salt taxes, the glittering courts of kings would have gone dark. Whether in Rome, China, France, or Africa, salt quietly tied societies together. It was not dramatic, but it was everywhere. Its taxes fed treasuries. Its scarcity fueled wars. Its price determined survival. Empires did not rise or fall on glory alone. They rose and fell on the price of salt. If salt was once powerful enough to build walls, fund armies, and spark revolutions, what does that tell us about the hidden forces today? Could it be that the foundations of our modern world, things we barely notice, are just as fragile, just as essential, and just as capable of shaping history when taken for granted? For thousands of years, salt was a foundation of civilization. It built roads, funded empires, and sparked revolutions. But like so many boring necessities of history, its era of dominance eventually came to an end. The decline of salt's power is as important as its rise, and its survival in a quieter form tells us how ordinary things can outlast glory. The decline of salt's central role began with technology. Advances in preservation changed everything. The invention of canning in the 18th and 19th centuries allowed food to be stored without heavy salting. Later, refrigeration removed the need for salt in daily survival. Salt was still useful, but it no longer held life or death importance. Armies no longer marched with barrels of salted pork as their only sustenance. Families no longer relied on salted fish or pickled vegetables to survive winters. Salt was demoted from empire builder to kitchen seasoning. As technology advanced, salt taxes became harder to justify. In France, the hated gabelle was finally abolished during the French Revolution. In India, Gandhi's salt march shattered British control, inspiring movements that weakened colonial authority. Salt, once a tool of oppression, became ordinary again. Its monopolies collapsed, its taxes vanished, and governments turned to new sources of revenue. What had been central became invisible. Even as salt lost its political power, it retained symbolic weight. In many cultures, salt remained tied to ritual. In China and Japan, salt is still used in purification ceremonies. In Christianity, salt symbolizes purity and incorruptibility. In Slavic traditions, bread and salt are offered to guests as signs of hospitality. Though no longer currency or tax base, salt continued to flavor the sacred. The industrial age gave salt a new life, not as food but as chemistry. Salt became essential for producing chlorine, sodium hydroxide, and countless compounds that fuel modern industry. Factories now consume salt in quantities empires could never imagine, transforming it from a household staple into an industrial raw material. Its power shifted from survival to science. Today, salt sits in every kitchen. We sprinkle it without thought, buy it for pennies, and forget its past. But each grain carries millennia of history. It was once weighed like gold, taxed like treasure, and fought over like land. Its story reminds us that civilization is not built only on grand monuments, but on small, ordinary things. Crystals scraped from beds, boiled from brine, or carried on camel caravans. So as we end the story of salt, one question remains. If something as ordinary as salt could once build empires, feed armies, and inspire revolutions, what everyday objects around us, unnoticed, cheap, and dull, might future historians look back on as the hidden foundations of our age? When we picture medieval castles, we see towering walls, banners snapping in the wind, knights clanking in armor, and kings feasting in great halls. But castles were not just fortresses of glory. They were homes. And like any home, they face a very practical, very boring question. Where does all the waste go? The answer shaped castle design as much as moats or battlements. Toilets, or as they were called, garderobes, were as essential to survival as swords. A castle was not just a family dwelling. It housed soldiers, servants, cooks, and sometimes hundreds of people during sieges. Imagine feeding that many mouths for weeks. Now imagine the waste. Without toilets, disease would spread quickly. Dysentery could kill more effectively than any invading army. To hold power, castles needed not just strong walls, but working sanitation. The medieval toilet was known as the garderobe, literally, guarding one's robes. Why such a name? Because people sometimes hung clothes in the shaft, believing the foul smells would repel moths. A garderobe was simple, a wooden bench with a hole built into a castle wall. Waste dropped down a vertical shaft, often into a moat or cesspit. In some castles, multiple garderobes were lined side by side, serving dozens of people at once. The design was crude but functional. It kept filth away from living quarters, channeled it downward, and allowed castles to remain relatively habitable. Castle builders devoted surprising care to toilet placement. Garderobes were often built into outer walls, with stone chutes projecting outward. In larger castles, entire towers were dedicated to them. At Harlech Castle in Wales, rows of garderobes lined the walls, each with its own chute. At Dover Castle in England, communal latrine blocks could serve dozens of soldiers. The placement mattered for defense. 2. Chutes had to empty where attackers could not crawl in. Engineers designed shafts to drop waste into moats, sometimes doubling as a foul deterrent. Imagine trying to storm a wall while sewage poured down from above. Of course, toilets required maintenance. Cesspits filled up, moats grew foul. Servants, the lowest of the low, had the thankless job of cleaning waste. Armed with shovels and buckets, they worked in the stench, unseen in chronicles but essential to survival. It was repetitive, degrading, and invisible labor. Yet without it, castles would have become unlivable prisons. Not all garderobes were equal. Lords had private toilets near their chambers, sometimes with stone seats and better ventilation. Servants and soldiers often shared communal blocks. Even in sanitation, hierarchy ruled. Still, the mere presence of so many toilets showed castles were not just fortresses of war, but living machines designed to keep entire populations functioning under stress. So when you picture a castle bristling against the horizon, ask yourself, was its strength really in its towers and walls, or was it in the hidden shafts, the countless garderobes, and the boring but vital systems that kept its people alive during the long, dark weeks of siege? When knights and armies clashed outside castle walls, it was easy to imagine that swords and catapults would decide the outcome. But inside, another enemy threatened: disease. More castles fell to foul water and poor sanitation than the battering rams. Toilets were not luxuries. They were weapons of survival. A medieval siege could last weeks, even months. Armies outside cut off supplies, waiting for hunger or illness to weaken defenders. Inside, hundreds of people crowded into tight quarters: lords, soldiers, peasants, cooks, even animals. Food could be rationed. Water could be stored. But waste kept coming every day, every hour. If it wasn't managed, the castle became a trap. Garderobes were designed to channel waste away. But under siege, they were tested to their limits. Some castles had dozens, even hundreds. To keep pace with numbers, engineers placed them strategically, often directing waste into moats. But there was a problem. Attackers knew this. Some besieging armies deliberately targeted garderobe chutes, trying to block them or even climb up through them. Others used waste-filled moats as breeding grounds for disease, hoping to infect defenders. A weak sanitation system could doom a castle as surely as a breached wall. Medieval people did not understand germs, but they understood filth brought sickness. Dysentery, cholera, and other illnesses spread rapidly when waste overflowed. Chronicles record armies inside castles struck down by the flux, endless diarrhea that left soldiers too weak to fight. Imagine a garrison of hundreds, confined within walls, sharing food, water, and crowded garderobes. A single cesspit overflowing could turn defenders into corpses before the enemy ever entered. The unsung heroes of siege life were the lowly servants who maintained toilets. Armed not with swords but with shovels, they emptied cesspits, cleared chutes, and kept waste flowing. Their work was filthy, repetitive, and invisible, yet it kept lords and soldiers alive. In many ways, these anonymous workers were as crucial as knights on horseback. Without them, castles could not withstand long sieges. Toilets also had unintended defensive uses. Waste channeled into moats created foul barriers. Attackers wading through them faced not only arrows but disease. Some castles deliberately designed garderobe chutes to dump waste down walls, making direct assaults both unpleasant and dangerous. It was crude but effective. A stinking moat could be as much a deterrent as stone battlements. Despite their ingenuity, toilets could also be a weak point. Some attackers used garderobe shafts to sneak inside castles, climbing the narrow passages under cover of night. Chroniclers tell of soldiers slipping through waste channels to open gates from within. Thus, garderobes were paradoxes, vital for survival, but dangerous if not protected. Castle builders had to balance sanitation with security. In the end, the fate of many sieges was not decided by catapults, but by whether waste could be managed. A castle with dozens of functioning garderobes could endure. A castle with clogged cesspits faced collapse. These details never appear in romantic tales of knights, but they were the difference between glory and ruin. So we must ask, were medieval castles truly monuments of stone and might, or were they at their core fragile machines sustained only by the boring hidden systems that kept waste flowing and disease at bay? Castles were not only built for sieges. For most of their lives, they served as homes, bustling with lords, ladies, servants, soldiers, and guests. In that daily rhythm, toilets were more than simple conveniences. They revealed hierarchy, shaped routines, and left a legacy still visible in castle ruins today. Not all garderobes were equal. Lords often enjoyed private garderobes attached to their chambers, sometimes with stone seats and better ventilation. In a few wealthy castles, these were even lined with wood for comfort. Servants and soldiers, however, were herded into communal blocks, long halls with benches pierced by multiple holes. where privacy was non-existent. Thus, even in the act of relieving oneself, social class dictated experience. The lord sat in relative comfort, while the servant squatted in a noisy row. The presence of dozens of garderobes shaped life inside castles. Morning and evening saw steady lines of use. Servants scrubbed seats and carried ash to cover wastes and pits. Buckets of water were sometimes poured down chutes to keep them clear. It was mundane, repetitive, and often smelly, but it was routine. In the same way bells marked prayer and kitchens marked meals, garderobes marked the rhythms of daily necessity. Earobes, vertical shafts built into thick walls, protruding stone chutes, and recesses that once held wooden benches. Archaeologists use these features to map how castles were lived in, not just how they were defended. Some castles, like Croc de Chevaliers in Syria or Bodiam in England, had entire towers dedicated to sanitation, with rows of garderobes stacked floor upon floor. These toilet towers remind us that waste management was not an afterthought, but an integral part of design. Though medieval sanitation seems crude by modern standards, it carried symbolic weight. Cleanliness was associated with order, morality, and discipline. Lords who provided ample garderobes for their castles were not just practical. They displayed care for their household and troops. In contrast, castles with poor sanitation risked not only disease but reputation. Chroniclers mocked foul-smelling halls and unkempt chambers as signs of weakness. Toilets, boring as they were, reflected on a lord's dignity. Today, tourists walking through castle ruins often stop at garderobes with curiosity, amused by their simplicity. Guides point out chutes in the walls, explaining how waste dropped into moats. Children laugh, adults wrinkle noses, but the truth is more serious. Garderobes kept castles alive. They remind us that behind every banquet, every knight's tale, every royal ceremony, ordinary human needs continued. Without toilets, castles would not have been centers of power. They would have been unbearable prisons. The story of garderobes is a story of infrastructure, unseen, unglamorous, but vital. Just as aqueducts sustained Rome and salt-fed empires, toilets sustained castles. Their shafts and cesspits were not heroic, but they were essential. History often overlooks these systems, preferring kings and battles. Yet castles stand today because their builders care about the boring details of waste. So, as you picture a medieval fortress on a hill, remember the hidden shafts within its walls. Were castles truly monuments to knightly glory? Or were they, in the end, monuments to toilets, silent proof that even empires rest on the ability to manage the most ordinary needs of life? When we think of ancient empires, we often picture armies, palaces, and battles. But the Persian Empire, vast, sprawling, and held together across thousands of miles, had another secret weapon, the postman. Not the kind who drops letters in mailboxes, but couriers who race day and night, carrying messages that bound the empire together. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. But with such vastness came a problem. How could orders from the king in Persepolis reach governors thousands of miles away in weeks, not months? The solution was the Royal Road, a network of highways and stations designed for speed. Along this road rode the couriers, mounted men tasked with carrying messages from one end of the empire to the other. They were fast, disciplined, and relentless. Herodotus, the Greek historian, marveled at their efficiency. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Centuries later, these words would be borrowed as the motto of modern postal services. But in origin they describe the Persians. The Royal Road stretched about 1,500 miles, from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa near the Persian heartland. Along it, at intervals of about 15 miles, the Persians built relay stations. At each station, a fresh horse and rider waited. When a courier arrived, he passed a message to the next rider, who galloped off without delay. In this way, messages could travel the full length of the empire in less than a week, a staggering speed for the ancient world. Behind this system was unglamorous work. Roads had to be leveled, stations stocked with horses, records kept of arrivals and departures. It was bureaucracy in motion. Ordinary laborers maintained the routes, repaired bridges, and kept wells clean. It was dull, repetitive, and thankless, but it gave the Persian king eyes and ears across continents. What did these couriers carry? Orders from the king, reports from satraps, provincial governors, requests for taxes, warnings of rebellions. A single sealed tablet could decide the fate of armies. Imagine a governor in distant Egypt receiving a message from Persepolis within days. That speed made rebellion less tempting. The empire could strike back before plots matured. The couriers themselves lived lives of exhaustion, riding hard day and night, exposed to heat, cold, and danger. They rarely rested, yet their duty was honored. To fail in delivery was to fail the king himself. These men were invisible in chronicles, but without them, the empire would have collapsed into silence. So we end this first section with a question. Was it the armies of Persia that built its empire, or the boring couriers, galloping through dust and night, carrying scraps of clay and parchment that held the empire's fate? The royal road was more than a highway. It was a bloodstream, carrying not just letters but lifeblood for the empire. Information. To rule millions across 3 continents, the Persian kings needed more than armies. They needed knowledge, and their couriers became the silent veins of power. On the surface, couriers carried official correspondence, tax orders, military dispatches, royal decrees. But woven into this network was intelligence gathering. Governors reported on rebellious whispers, troop movements, and grain harvests. These reports sped to the king, who could act before threats turned into crises. For a subject of the empire, this system was intimidating. To defy Persia meant more than facing armies. It meant being known. The king's eyes and ears rode on horseback, watching from afar. Persia ruled through satraps, regional governors responsible for taxes, defense, and order. The courier network tied them directly to the king. A satrap who delayed or disobeyed could not hide. His reports were cross-checked against those of other officials. The king might learn of corruption or rebellion in weeks. This made the system both efficient and terrifying. The couriers, faceless and tireless, ensured that no satrap was ever beyond the reach of Persepolis. At each relay station, couriers exchanged more than horses. They signed records, logged times, and checked seals. Clerks monitored the system, ensuring no letter was tampered with. It was bureaucracy at its dullest. Lists, seals, schedules. Yet this boredom was the backbone of empire. Without clerks scratching in wax and clay, without stable masters feeding horses, without laborers maintaining wells, the whole network would collapse. The Persian postal system was not glorious. It was meticulous. Herodotus admired the speed of the couriers. Greek generals, facing Persia, knew the system gave their enemy an edge. Messages from one frontier could reach the king before Greek armies even began to march. To enemies, the Persian couriers seemed like ghosts, unseen, relentless, arriving with orders that moved armies like chess pieces. To allies, they represented security. Merchants could trust roads patrolled and maintained for speed. The empire's reputation for order rested not just on soldiers, but on couriers. A courier's life was harsh. He rode hard through heat and snow, slept little, and faced dangers of bandits or wild animals. Yet couriers carried a strange honor. They were the veins of the king. To stop was to betray the empire. We know little of their personal lives. They left no memoirs, no records. Their existence was absorbed into the state. They served. But in their silence, they embodied the Persian ideal: loyalty, endurance, invisibility. Some historians believe the courier system doubled as a spy network. Messages may have carried not only official orders, but secret reports from informants. The speed of the couriers made espionage effective, giving the king knowledge of distant intrigues. The very roads couriers rode became symbols of Persian power. To live along the royal road was to live under surveillance. If the Persian Empire was held together not by monuments, but by messages, we must ask, was its strength truly in its armies, or in its couriers and clerks, the unseen hands who carried scraps of clay and ink across deserts, turning paper into power? For centuries, the couriers of Persia galloped across deserts, mountains, and plains, carrying the words of kings. But like the empire itself, The network of messages eventually unraveled. Its fall and its survival in echoes reveals how even the most boring systems can outlast glory. The Persian courier network thrived under the Achaemenid kings, from Cyrus to Darius and Xerxes. But with conquest came vulnerability. When Alexander the Great stormed Persia in the 4th century BCE, he recognized the brilliance of the royal road and used it himself. Yet, once Persia fell, the network faltered. Without the central authority of Persepolis, relay stations decayed. Roads went untended. Horses were no longer kept ready. The speed that once bound an empire slowed to silence. Yet the idea survived. The Romans, impressed by Persia's couriers, built their own system of roads and messengers, the cursus publicus. Like Persia, Rome relied on relay stations, official seals, and fresh horses. Centuries later, medieval kingdoms imitated the model. Riders carried royal commands from court to court. Even the Mongols, ruling an empire larger than Persia's, established a relay network strikingly similar to the royal road. The Persians did not just send messages across their empire. They sent the very concept of organized communication across history. Think of what was required. Roads kept level across thousands of miles. Horses bred, trained, and stabled at regular stations. Clerks recording arrivals, seals, and timings. Workers digging wells and repairing bridges. This was not the work of heroes, but of anonymous laborers. Their names are lost, their tasks forgotten, yet their efforts kept empires alive. Today, when a letter crosses continents in days, when a package arrives at your door tracked by barcodes and databases, you are living in the shadow of Persia's couriers. The motto once written by Herodotus, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor night," still defines postal service today. The boring details, routes, schedules, records are the true miracle. Without them, no empire, ancient or modern, could function. Imagine, for a moment, the last Persian courier riding his route as Alexander's armies closed in. The stations still stand. The horses are still waiting. The seals still pressing clay. He gallops across dust and stone, carrying a message that may never be read. Unaware that his system is ending, it is a lonely image. Yet his ride echoes still, every time a message crosses distance faster than footsteps. So we end with a question. If the Persian Empire is remembered for its kings and wars, should it not also be remembered for its couriers, those unseen riders whose boring, relentless labor invented the very idea of communication across empire, a legacy that still shapes the world today? Long before kings raised armies or scribes carved laws, there were farmers, bent under the sun, coaxing barley and wheat from the fertile soil between the Tigris and Euphrates. And from these fields came something that would shape civilization more than swords or palaces: taxes. In early Mesopotamia, around 3000 BC, the rivers flooded yearly, leaving behind rich silt. Farmers grew more than they needed, producing surpluses of grain, dates, and livestock. But abundance raised questions. Who owned the extra? How was it stored? Who decided how much each farmer kept? The answer, slowly but surely, became the state. Temples were among the earliest centers of taxation. Priests demanded offerings of grain, oil, or animals, not just as worship, but as economic necessity. These goods filled temple storehouses, funding rituals and feeding the city's workers. Over time, kings replaced priests as tax collectors. Palaces built vast granaries where farmers' contributions were stored. Soldiers ensured compliance. What began as offerings to gods became obligations to rulers. Without coins, taxes were recorded in grain and livestock. A farmer might owe 10 jars of barley or 3 sheep. To track these payments, scribes pressed records into clay tablets. Some of the earliest writing we possess, cuneiform, is nothing more than tax receipts. Picture it: a wedge-shaped stylus pressed into wet clay, noting that one family delivered 30 measures of wheat. These dull marks, baked and stored, with a foundation of bureaucracy. Writing itself may have been born from a need to remember who paid and who did not. For the farmer, taxes were not abstract. They were backbreaking. A man rose at dawn, harvested his barley, bundled it, and watched as officials measured a portion into state sacks. The best grain often went to the palace. What remained fed his family. Failure to pay meant punishment. Confiscation, fines, or worse. Taxes were the invisible thread binding farmers to rulers. The land might have been fertile, but it was never free. To modernize, taxation looks dull. Numbers, tallies, clay tablets, and dusty archives. But without it, Mesopotamian cities could not have survived. Taxes funded irrigation canals, temple building, and armies. They turned scattered farms into organized states. Behind every brick laid in Babylon, every canal dug in Sumer, was the boring work of collection. Scribes marking tablets, guards enforcing quotas, farmers unloading grain. So we end this section with a question. Was civilization built by kings and warriors, or by farmers, bent in the sun, paying their dues in barley, their sweat pressed into clay as the first taxes in human history? If Section 1 showed us the farmer handing over barley, Section 2 shows us where that barley went, into the foundations of the world's first cities and states. Taxes were not just burdens. They were the scaffolding of Mesopotamian civilization. The simplest use of taxes was storage. Grain poured into temple and palace granaries, where it was sealed in jars and measured in shekels and talents. In times of famine, these reserves fed cities. In times of plenty, they funded projects. Taxes turned unpredictable harvests into steady supply. They created the possibility of planning. A city could survive bad years because of good years already collected. Mesopotamia was full of massive construction projects. Ziggurats climbing into the sky. Canals stretching for miles, walls encircling cities. None of these could have been built without taxes. Grain collected from farmers fed workers who hauled bricks, dug channels, and carved statues. Payment was often in rations rather than coin. Jars of beer, bread, onions, dates. In this sense, taxes fed not only projects but people. Every baked brick of Ur in Babylon was mortared with barley taxes. Taxes also bought protection or oppression, depending on perspective. Stored grain fed soldiers on campaign. Livestock collected from villages supplied cavalry and sacrifices. Armies marched because farmers paid. Kings claimed glory, but their spears were balanced on the shoulders of peasants who surrendered their harvests each year. To manage all this, Mesopotamia built the first bureaucracies. Scribes tracked tax quotas. Overseers inspected fields. Messengers delivered records to palaces. The tablets they left behind are astonishingly dull. Endless lists of grain, sheep, oil jars. Yet these tablets are the birth certificates of government. Without taxes, rulers would have remained warlords. With taxes, they became administrators. Taxation was never simple. Officials often skimmed grain for themselves, or demanded more than quotas required. Poor farmers groaned under burdens, while elites found ways to evade. Revolts sometimes broke out when taxes grew unbearable. Kings had to balance greed with survival. Squeeze too tightly, and the farmer stopped producing. Too lightly, and the state grew weak. This balancing act, how much to take, how much to leave, became the eternal problem of rulers everywhere. From the outside, taxation was monotonous. Measurements, tallies, deliveries, receipts. But in practice, it created miracles. Cities where none had existed, armies that defended borders, temples that reached the skies. Civilization was not built by inspiration alone. It was built by record keepers with styluses, counting grain until their hands cramped. So the question remains, were Mesopotamian ziggurats monuments to gods, or monuments to taxes, built from barley and sweat? Each brick stamped not with divine blessing, but with the dull arithmetic of farmers' dues? Taxes in Mesopotamia were not just about collecting grain or feeding soldiers. Over centuries, they shaped laws, institutions, and the very idea of a state. And though the kings and temples of Mesopotamia crumbled, the habit of taxation never left us. One of the earliest surviving law codes, the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1750 BCE, contains numerous clauses about taxation. It set penalties for tax evasion, limits on corrupt collectors, and rules for how much farmers owed. These were not lofty philosophical laws. They were practical attempts to regulate the flow of barley, dates, and livestock. Justice in Mesopotamia was often about making sure taxes reached the palace. The connection between law and tax was profound. To obey the king meant to pay. To break the law often meant failing in your obligations to the treasury. As Mesopotamian ideas spread, so did taxation. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians all inherited the system. Each empire adjusted quotas, but the principle remained. Rulers lived on the surplus of farmers. The Assyrians demanded not just food, but labor, corvée service, where peasants worked on canals or fortifications. The Persians built upon Mesopotamian precedent with their tribute system, extracting wealth from subject peoples across continents. The seed planted in the barley fields of Sumer grew into the financial backbone of empire after empire. Taxes made states possible, but they also fueled resentment. Heavy burdens drove peasants into debt, slavery, or revolt. Some villages abandoned fields rather than pay. Others rioted against corrupt officials. Every ruler faced the same dilemma. Take too much and the people break. Take too little and the state weakens. Mesopotamia's kings were no different. Their glory depended on a balancing act between greed and survival. Behind it all stood the scribes. Bent over clay tablets, they recorded every sheep, every measure of grain. Their tablets fill museum shelves today, row upon row of numbers. To us, they look monotonous. To them, they were lifelines of empire. Without scribes, there was no taxation. Without taxation, no state. These anonymous men with their styluses in their steady hands were as crucial as kings. Though Mesopotamia fell, its system of taxation lived on. The very concept of levying dues, recording them in writing, and enforcing them with law spread across civilizations. Today, we still inherit that legacy. Our governments still demand a portion of labor, income, or property. We still keep receipts, file records, and complain about unfair burdens. The tools have changed, paper instead of clay, digital forms instead of tablets. But the principle is the same. It is tempting to see taxation as dull, repetitive, and unchanging. And in many ways, it is. The arguments, too high, too unfair, too corrupt, have not shifted in 5,000 years. Yet, that very continuity is remarkable. Taxes have outlasted dynasties, empires, and revolutions. They are the quiet thread tying modern life to the first farmers of Mesopotamia. So as we pay our taxes today, we are not merely following modern law. We are echoing an ancient ritual, begun when a farmer in Sumer handed over jars of barley, watched a scribe press marks in the clay, and muttered under his breath about the unfairness of all. The question that haunted Mesopotamian farmers still haunts us. Do we pay taxes because it's just, or because no civilization, no matter how grand, can survive without the boring, endless burden of collection? When we think of mathematics, we picture numbers on a page, digits, equations, symbols. But for much of history, math was not written. It was moved. It lived not on parchment, but on boards and beads. And the simplest, most boring of these tools, the abacus, shaped economies, governments, and trade for centuries. Before writing systems for numbers became common, merchants and clerks faced a problem: how to track large quantities of goods and money. Fingers sufficed for small sums, but what of taxes in grain, trade in silver, or debts spanning households? The solution was the counting board. Early versions appeared in Mesopotamia and Greece. Flat surfaces marked with lines where pebbles or counters could be placed. From these humble beginnings, the abacus evolved. By the 2nd century BCE, China had developed the suanpan, a wooden frame strung with rods, each holding beads. 2 beads above the crossbar represented fives. 5 beads below represented ones. By sliding beads up and down, clerks could perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division with startling speed. To the untrained eye, it looked like play, beads clacking on rods. But for merchants and officials, it was power. A skilled operator could calculate faster than most people today with pen and paper. The Romans, too, used a form of abacus, a small bronze board with grooves and counters, known as a calculi board, from which we get the word calculate. Roman tax collectors and merchants carried them, sliding pebbles as they tallied sums. In markets and courts, these boards were the difference between confusion and clarity. Numbers were not abstractions. They were movements of stone across bronze. At first glance, the abacus is dull. Wooden beads monotonously slid back and forth. But that dullness was its genius. Unlike memorized numbers or fragile parchments, the abacus was reliable. It required no literacy, no ink, no complex symbols. Anyone trained in its use could compute. This made mathematics accessible far beyond scholarly elites. Farmers, traders, tax collectors, all could wield an abacus. Civilization itself was carried not just by philosophers, but by bead pushers. Picture a Chinese market. Stalls of silk, tea, and rice. A merchant haggles with a buyer, then pulls out his suin pan. Beads clack as he calculates totals, discounts, and debts. The buyer watches, trusting the visible rhythm of movement. The deal is sealed not by trust and memory, but by the authority of beads. The sound of clacking abacus beads became the background music of commerce, a sound as ordinary and as vital as the ringing of coins. So we pause here with a question. Was the abacus merely a tool for math, or was it something greater, a way of turning the abstract into the physical? Proof that even the most advanced ideas of civilization rest on beads sliding across wood? If Section 1 showed us the abacus as invention, Section 2 reveals it as revolution. Across Asia and Europe, the abacus spread silently, crossing cultures and centuries, clacking its way into markets, palaces, and schools. The Silk Road carried more than silk. Along its dusty routes moved ideas, technologies, and tools, including the abacus. Chinese traders brought their suin pan westward. Arab merchants adopted their own variants. Europeans refined counting boards into more complex devices. In every caravanserai and marketplace, the abacus became as essential as scales or measures. Where goods change hands, beads change positions. By the Middle Ages, the abacus was more than a merchant's tool. It was a classroom necessity. Children across Asia and Europe learned arithmetic not from written equations, but from beads. In Japan, the soroban became central to education. Teachers drilled students with problems, adding, subtracting, multiplying. Speed was valued, accuracy essential. The rhythm of beads trained generations in discipline and logic. Even today, abacus schools exist in parts of Asia, where children learn to visualize beads in their minds, mental abacus, performing calculations faster than many can manage on calculators. Why did people trust the abacus? Because it was visible. Unlike written numbers, which required literacy, the abacus showed its work. A merchant could demonstrate calculations openly, sliding beads in front of a buyer. Disputes vanished in the rhythm of motion. This transparency made trade smoother. Buyers trusted sellers, officials trusted merchants, and kings trusted tax collectors, all because beads did not lie. China, the suin pan with 2 beads above and 5 below. Japan, the soroban streamlined to 1 bead above and 4 below, improving speed. Russia, the skoti, with a single row of 10 beads per wire, used in vertical frames. Europe, counting board with grooves and counters, precursors to the modern abacus. Each culture adapted the abacus to its needs, but the principle remained the same, moving objects to represent numbers. Day after day, clerks and merchants slid beads to balance accounts. It was repetitive, monotonous, even meditative. Yet this boredom was civilization's backbone. Ships sailed, markets thrived, and empires taxed effectively because someone sat at a desk, clacking beads from left to right. It was not glorious, but it worked. The abacus was more than a tool. It was a way of thinking. Users developed an intuitive grasp of numbers, patterns, and place value. In many cases, abacus-trained merchants outperformed those with written numerals. Long after Arabic numerals spread into Europe, merchants clung to their abacuses. Paper could be forged or misread. Beads could be trusted. So as the abacus spread across cultures, we must ask, was it merely a counting tool? Or was it the first universal language of mathematics, a quiet, clacking bridge that carried trade, trust, and education across the ancient world? For centuries, the abacus was civilization's calculator. From Chinese markets to Roman tax offices, its clacking beads kept trade flowing and governments afloat. But like all tools, it eventually faced decline, challenged by new systems of numbers, then by machines. Yet, surprisingly, it never disappeared. The abacus's decline began with writing. Not just any writing, but the adoption of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system. When the digits 0 to 9 spread into Europe and Asia, they offered something the abacus could not: compact, written calculation. Instead of sliding beads, a clerk could add and subtract on paper. Multiplication tables replaced mental beadwork. Accountants began training in penmanship rather than bead technique. The abacus did not vanish overnight. Merchants distrusted new numerals, clinging to the visible proof of beads. But slowly, the habit of written arithmetic spread. By the 17th century, mechanical calculators began to appear. Blaise Pascal's Pascaline and later Leibniz's stepped reckoner promised a future wheels and gears replacing human fingers. In the 19th and 20th centuries, adding machines and cash registers further marginalized the abacus. Finally, the electronic calculator, followed by the computer, seemed to bury it. Why slide beads when silicon could compute in nanoseconds? And yet, the abacus refused to vanish. In Japan, China, and parts of Russia, abacuses remained in schools well into the 20th century. Even today, children train on sorobands, not because they lack calculators, but because the abacus teaches mental discipline. Through repetition, students learn to visualize beads moving in their minds. This mental abacus lets them calculate astonishingly fast, sometimes outpacing electronic calculators in basic operations. The tool survived not as necessity, but as pedagogy. The abacus also survived as symbol. It adorns shop signs, logos of banks, and art celebrating heritage. For many cultures, it represents not just calculation but tradition, a reminder of the merchants and scribes whose boring beadwork built civilizations. In China, the abacus became a metaphor for accounting and careful planning. To move beads was to deliberate with precision. Even as modern calculators replaced it, the abacus remained a cultural icon. What makes the abacus remarkable is not its sophistication, but its simplicity. A wooden frame, a few beads, and a human hand. Together, they could calculate taxes, divide inheritance, or tally trade routes. It required no electricity, no ink, no parchment. It was cheap, durable, and universal. For over 2,000 years, it was the most reliable computer on Earth. Every time we tap on a calculator app, every time an algorithm runs on silicon, we are walking in the footsteps of bead pushers. The abacus taught humanity that numbers could be manipulated systematically, that arithmetic was not magic but movement. Its legacy is not just in the markets of old, but in the digital world we inhabit. Without the abacus, the mental leap to mechanical and electronic calculation might never have happened. So, as the beads rest and the clacking falls silent, we are left with question. Was the abacus merely a tool that faded into history, or was it the quiet ancestor of every machine, every algorithm, and every calculator that now defines our modern age? High in the Andes, long before Europeans brought clocks, the Inca ruled one of the largest empires in the world. Their roads stretched for thousands of miles. Their armies marched in perfect order. Their granaries fed millions. Yet they had no written numbers, no wheels, no mechanical clocks. How, then, did they tell time? The answer was as simple as it was profound: shadows. For the Inca, time was not hours and minutes. It was cycles: the rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, the seasons of planting and harvest. Precision mattered. Farmers needed to know when to sow maize, when to dig potatoes, when to prepare terraces for rain. Priests needed to know when to hold rituals, when to sacrifice, when to honor gods. Without accuracy, survival faltered. But in the high mountains, the sun itself became the great clock. In the Inca capital of Cusco, tall stone pillars were placed on hillsides surrounding the city. These Syac markers tracked the sun's path. As the sun rose and set, priests watched where shadows fell between the pillars. Each alignment marked specific days, solstices, equinoxes, and agricultural milestones. The system was elegant. The sun itself moved, the stones stayed still, and the shadows told the story of a year. Not only priests used shadows. In villages, farmers watched the length of midday shadows to gauge seasons. A short shadow meant summer. Long shadows meant winter. Children learned to read the Earth's clock by watching their own shadows stretch and shrink as they played. The knowledge was ordinary, passed through generations, embedded in daily life. It was not dramatic, but it worked. The Inca did not separate time from religion. Priests announced festivals and planting seasons based on solar shadows. When the sun reached certain points, offerings were made to Inti, the sun god. This gave rulers immense power. To control time was to control ritual, and to control ritual was to control people. Ordinary farmers trusted priests to tell them when to plant. In truth, priests were reading shadows. What seems boring, stones light and dark, was in fact the machinery of empire. Reading shadows required no tools, no writing, no machines. It was universal, cheap, and accurate enough for empire. The Inca did not need clocks ticking in palaces. They had mountains, stones, and the sun. Civilization was sustained not by inventions of iron, but by the careful watching of something as ordinary as a shadow stretching across the ground. So we close this first section with a question. Was Inca power built on armies and roads, or on the simple, boring discipline of watching shadows fall across stone, turning light into the heartbeat of empire? If the Inca used shadows to guide their daily lives, they also used them to shape their empire. Shadows were not just practical tools for farming. They became woven into temples, rituals, and the very architecture of the Inca world.